Elizabeth Morgan stood at the kitchen island, methodically chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board matched the ticking of the wall clock, steady, predictable, unchanging. Like her marriage to David, now in its 18th year. She glanced at her watch. 6:45. David would be home by 7:30, as he always was on Thursdays. He would greet her with a kiss on the cheek, pour himself a glass of wine, and ask about her day while scrolling through emails on his phone. She would tell him about her meeting with a client at the interior design firm where she worked, and he would nod without looking up. Later, they would eat dinner at the table, exchange pleasantries about their respective days, and retreat to separate corners of the house, David to his study to catch up on work, Elizabeth to the living room to sketch new design concepts or read. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. This was their rhythm, comfortable and worn like an old sweater. When had comfort morphed into complacency? When had predictability become a prison? Elizabeth sighed, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 43, she was still attractive, her green eyes bright, her smile genuine if somewhat less frequent these days. Motherhood and marriage had changed her body, but she kept fit with morning runs and yoga. David still called her beautiful on occasion, usually before social events or when intoxicated, the words sounding more like habit than revelation. Their daughter, Lily, was now a sophomore at Berkeley, her absence leaving the house with a hollowness that neither Elizabeth nor David seemed able to fill. The silence between them stretched longer each day, filled with words unsaid and feelings unexplored. The sound of her phone ringing pulled Elizabeth from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a towel and checked the screen. Mark Henderson, David's colleague from the architectural firm, where they both worked as partners. "Hello," she answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she continued chopping. "Elizabeth, hi. It's Mark." His voice was distinctive, slightly husky with a warmth that always made her feel he was genuinely pleased to speak with her. Unlike most of David's colleagues, who treated her with polite indifference at company functions, Mark engaged with her, asked questions about her work, and actually listened to her answers. "Mark, hi. David's not home yet. Actually, I was calling for you. About the gala fundraiser next month. David mentioned you might be willing to help with the design committee since they're short-handed." Elizabeth paused, knife suspended above the cutting board. "He didn't mention it to me." "Oh." A beat of silence. "Well, that's David for you. Probably got caught up in the Henderson project and forgot. But we could really use someone with your eye for design. The proceeds go to the children's hospital expansion." Elizabeth felt a small spark of pleasure at being sought out for her professional skills, rather than as David's wife. What would it involve? Mostly helping to transform the hotel ballroom from its usual corporate blandness into something spectacular. Working with the florist, selecting linens, lighting design. Your expertise would be invaluable. Elizabeth found herself smiling. "That actually sounds lovely. When would you need me?" "There's a committee meeting tomorrow afternoon at 4 if you're free. At the firm. I know it's short notice. She should check with David first. That would be the proper thing to do." But something rebellious stirred in her, a desire to make a decision without consultation, to be valued for her own talents. "I'll be there," she said. "Great. I'll text you the details." "And Elizabeth?" "Yes. Thank you. This means a lot." After they hung up, Elizabeth stood motionless in the kitchen, aware of a subtle shift in her mood. She felt lighter, energized in a way she hadn't in months. The thought of the committee meeting tomorrow gave her something to anticipate, a small disruption in the predictable rhythm of her days. When David arrived home at precisely 7:28, Elizabeth was plating their dinner, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. "Something smells good," he said, placing his briefcase by the kitchen door and loosening his tie. He gave her the expected peck on the cheek and reached for the wine bottle. "How was your day?" she asked, watching him pour a generous glass of Cabernet. "Busy. The Henderson project is hitting some roadblocks with the city's historical preservation board." He took a long sip. "You? Good. I finalized the design for the Petersons' living room." She paused, waiting to see if he would mention the fundraiser committee. When he didn't, she added, "Mark Henderson called." David looked up from his phone. "Mark? What did he want?" He asked if I could help with the design committee for next month's gala. For the children's hospital. Oh, right. David nodded absently. Must have slipped my mind to mention it. The firm needs volunteers. Did you agree? I did. There's a meeting tomorrow at 4. Good. They'll be lucky to have you. His attention was already drifting back to his phone. They ate dinner with their usual sparse conversation. David talked about work challenges, while Elizabeth noticed how seldom he asked about her day or her thoughts. When had they stopped being curious about each other? Later that night, as she lay beside David in their bed, listening to his even breathing, Elizabeth found herself thinking about Mark. She remembered their first meeting at a company Christmas party 3 years ago. David had been caught up with clients, and she'd been standing alone near the bar when Mark approached. Unlike most of David's colleagues who treated spouses as ornamental, Mark had engaged her in genuine conversation about architecture and design. He'd asked her opinion on the adaptive reuse project the firm was undertaking, and they'd spent nearly an hour discussing the challenges of modernizing historical structures while preserving their character. Since then, their interactions had been infrequent, but always stimulating. At company events, they inevitably found themselves in conversation, often losing track of time. Elizabeth had noticed how Mark's blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how he leaned in slightly when she spoke, as if her words were valuable treasures he didn't want to miss. She rolled onto her side, facing away from David's sleeping form. The thought of seeing Mark tomorrow brought a flutter of anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. She was a married woman in her 40s, not some lovesick teenager. Yet she couldn't deny the spark of life she felt when thinking about their upcoming interaction, a vitality that had been absent from her marriage for longer than she cared to admit. Elizabeth closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Mark's voice on the phone, the warmth in his tone when he thanked her. It was just a committee meeting, she told herself. Just a professional interaction with her husband's colleague. Nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth knew she was lying to herself. Something had shifted, some dormant part of her awakening from a long slumber, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to put it back to sleep. The next day, Elizabeth found herself spending an unusual amount of time selecting her outfit for the committee meeting. She finally settled on a forest green wrap dress that complemented her eyes and auburn hair, paired with modest heels. Professional but flattering. She applied makeup with more care than usual, adding a touch of color to her lips that she typically reserved for special occasions. As she drove to the architectural firm, Elizabeth chastised herself for her schoolgirl nervousness. She was simply attending a meeting for a charity fundraiser. Her husband's office was in the same building. There was nothing inappropriate about any of this. The receptionist directed her to a conference room on the 4th floor. When she entered, several people were already seated around a large table, including Mark, who stood immediately upon seeing her. "Elizabeth, thank you for coming." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. He introduced her to the other committee members, 2 women from the hospital board, another architect from the firm, and a representative from the hotel venue. "We're thrilled to have someone with your design expertise," said one of the hospital board members. "Mark has been singing your praises." Elizabeth felt a flush of pleasure as she took the seat Mark had pulled out for her coincidentally, right next to his. Their arms brushed as they both reached for the meeting agenda, the brief contact sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Sorry," they said in unison, then laughed. The meeting proceeded efficiently, with discussions about budget, potential themes, and logistical concerns. Elizabeth found herself fully engaged, offering suggestions about lighting techniques that could transform the space without excessive cost. The committee responded enthusiastically to her ideas. "This is exactly why we needed you," Mark said, his eyes meeting hers with appreciation. "You see possibilities the rest of us miss." The meeting concluded after an hour, with assignments distributed among the members. Elizabeth would visit the venue the following week to assess the space and develop a comprehensive design plan. As the others filed out, Mark lingered. "Do you have time for coffee? I'd love to hear more about your thoughts for the space." Elizabeth hesitated. Coffee with a colleague was perfectly innocent, yet something about Mark's invitation felt weighted with possibility. "I should probably check if David is ready to head home," she said, the responsible response. "Of course." Mark's expression revealed nothing, but she thought she detected a flicker of disappointment. Another time, perhaps. She nodded, gathering her notes. I'll see you next week at the venue walkthrough. Looking forward to it, he replied, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Elizabeth made her way to David's office, her thoughts in disarray. Why had she declined coffee? Was she overreacting to an innocent professional interaction? Or was she right to establish boundaries where none seemed necessary? David was on a call when she arrived, gesturing for her to wait. She watched him through the glass wall of his office, confident, authoritative, completely in his element. The man she had fallen in love with 20 years ago. Yet somehow, over the years, they had drifted into parallel lives, connected but separate. When had David last looked at her the way Mark had in the conference room, as if her thoughts were fascinating, her presence a gift? David ended his call and waved her in. How was the committee meeting? Good. Productive. She hesitated. Mark asked me to coffee afterward to discuss design ideas, but I said I should check if you were ready to leave. David was already checking his email again. You didn't need to do that. I've got at least another hour here. You should have gone. Oh. Elizabeth felt oddly deflated by his response. Had she wanted him to be jealous? To claim her time? Well, it's fine. We'll have time to discuss everything at the venue walkthrough next week. David nodded absently. That's good of you to help with this, Liz. The firm appreciates it. The firm. Not him. Not Mark specifically. I should get home and start dinner, she said. I'll be late. Don't wait for me. He barely looked up as she left. Driving home alone, Elizabeth found herself replaying moments from the meeting, the way Mark leaned forward when she spoke, how his fingers had accidentally brushed hers when passing a document, the intensity in his eyes when he thanked her for her contributions. Small moments, meaningless in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that both thrilled and troubled her. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. Yet the flutter in her stomach when she thought about seeing Mark again felt like a betrayal of sorts, not of actions, but of emotions. At home, in the emptiness of a house that no longer contained a child's laughter or the energetic chaos of family life, Elizabeth poured herself a glass of wine and stood at the kitchen window, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty struck her with unexpected force, and she realized how long it had been since she truly noticed such things: the shifting colors of the sky, the precise quality of early evening light, the silent poetry of shadows lengthening across the lawn. She had let parts of herself go dormant, the parts that noticed beauty, that felt passion, that yearned for connection beyond the comfortable routine she and David had established. Now those dormant parts were stirring, awakened not by her husband of 18 years, but by brief moments of genuine connection with another man. Elizabeth took a long sip of wine, the realization settling over her with equal parts excitement and dread. She wasn't looking for an affair. She didn't want to destroy her marriage or hurt David, but she couldn't deny the hunger that had awakened in her, not just for physical intimacy, though that was part of it, but for the simple pleasure of being seen, being heard, being valued. As darkness fell, Elizabeth remained at the window, watching as lights came on in neighboring houses, illuminating other lives, other stories. She wondered how many other women stood in darkened kitchens contemplating the shape of their marriages, the contours of their desires, the silent spaces between what they had and what they wanted. When her phone chimed with a text message, her heart quickened. She looked at the screen. Mark, thanks again for joining the committee. Your ideas were brilliant. Looking forward to working with you on this project. A simple professional message. Nothing inappropriate. Yet Elizabeth stared at it for long minutes, her finger hovering over the reply button, aware that how she responded mattered to her marriage, to her sense of self, to whatever undefined thing was stirring between her and Mark. Finally, she typed, "Happy to help. See you at the walkthrough. Neutral. Safe. True." But as she set her phone down and poured another glass of wine, Elizabeth knew that safety was not what her heart was longing for. The week following the committee meeting passed with excruciating slowness. Elizabeth found herself counting the days until Tuesday's venue walkthrough, then chiding herself for such adolescent anticipation. She threw herself into work, taking on 2 new clients and spending long hours at her drafting table, as if intense focus on interior spaces might distract her from her interior life. David noticed, nothing unusual in her behavior. Their routine continued unchanged, parallel lives intersecting for meals and sleep, exchanging information rather than intimacies. On Sunday morning, as they sat across from each other at breakfast, newspapers creating physical barriers between them, Elizabeth studied her husband over the top of the lifestyle section. At 46, David remained handsome, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples, laugh lines deepening around his eyes. When had she stopped really looking at him? When had he stopped really seeing her? "I was thinking," she began, lowering her paper, "maybe we could do something different next weekend. Drive up the coast, maybe stay overnight somewhere." David glanced up, surprised. "Next weekend? I've got the Henderson presentation on Monday. You could work on it during the week." He frowned slightly. "It's not that simple, Liz. This project is crucial for the firm." He returned to his newspaper. "Maybe in a few weeks when things settle down." Things never settled down. There was always another project, another deadline, another reason to postpone living. Elizabeth felt a familiar disappointment settle in her chest, followed by a flicker of resentment. She couldn't remember the last time David had prioritized their relationship over work. "I have the venue walkthrough on Tuesday," she said. "For the gala." He turned a page. "What time? I might be able to stop by." "You don't need to do that." The words came out more sharply than she intended. David looked up, finally giving her his full attention. "Is everything okay, Liz?" She considered telling him, then not about Mark specifically, since there was nothing concrete to tell, but about her dissatisfaction, her loneliness, her hunger for something more than their comfortable coexistence. Instead, she said, "I'm fine. Just busy with work." He nodded, already retreating behind his newspaper. "We both are. It's just a busy season." Their entire marriage had become a busy season, Elizabeth thought, watching him return to his reading. When was the last time they had had a real conversation that wasn't about schedules, finances, or their daughter? When was the last time they had looked at each other with desire rather than familiarity? Tuesday arrived with a clarity of sky that seemed to mock Elizabeth's internal confusion. She dressed with particular care, a silk blouse in a deep teal that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, tailored black pants, and heels that added 2 inches to her 5'6" frame. Professional but striking. She applied makeup with precision, then removed and reapplied her lipstick, dissatisfied with the first shade. The venue walkthrough was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Mark had texted the previous evening to confirm, a simple professional message that nonetheless sent her heart racing. Elizabeth had shown the text to David over dinner, a deliberate act of transparency that felt both righteous and deceptive. He had barely glanced at it, mumbling something about being glad the committee was on track. Elizabeth arrived at the hotel 15 minutes early, her design portfolio tucked under her arm. The grand ballroom was empty when she entered, the vastness of it emphasized by rows of stacked chairs against one wall and bare round tables scattered throughout the space. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, creating patterns on the parquet floor. She moved slowly through the room, mentally transforming the blank canvas. The space had good bones, high ceilings with ornate molding, crystal chandeliers that needed only proper cleaning to sparkle, elegant proportions. Elizabeth began sketching in her notebook, ideas flowing freely for the first time in weeks. "You look completely in your element." She turned to find Mark watching her from the doorway, his expression appreciative. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, a light blue shirt open at the collar. No tie. The casual elegance of it struck her as quintessentially Mark, professional but unconventional. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, closing her notebook. "Just a moment." He crossed the room toward her. "Your focus was impressive. Already having ideas." She nodded, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the vast space. The room has excellent architectural features to work with. The moldings, the proportions. "Show me what you're thinking." They stood side by side as she reopened her notebook, their shoulders nearly touching as she pointed out her preliminary sketches. Mark leaned in to see better, his cologne something subtle with notes of cedar enveloping her. "You're thinking of creating different zones within the space," he observed. Elizabeth nodded, pleased by his quick understanding. "Exactly. The main dining area here, a lounge section there near the windows, and a more intimate bar area in that alcove. It's brilliant." creating a flow that encourages both mingling and private conversations. His genuine appreciation of her ideas, so different from David's polite but distant acknowledgement of her work, warmed her more than it should have. They walked the space together, discussing lighting possibilities, table arrangements, and how to incorporate the children's hospital theme without making the gala feel clinical or maudlin. "What about here?" Mark gestured to a small anteroom off the main ballroom. "This space seems isolated." They entered the smaller room together. It was darker than the main ballroom, with just one window and lower ceilings. Their voices echoed slightly in the empty space. "It's perfect for a quiet exhibition area," Elizabeth said. "We could display artwork from the children at the hospital, maybe set up information about the expansion project for potential major donors." Mark nodded, studying not the room but her. "You see possibilities everywhere." "It's my job," she said lightly, though something in his gaze made her pulse quicken. "It's more than that. It's how you see the world." He paused. David is a lucky man. The mention of her husband's name hung between them, a reminder of invisible boundaries. Elizabeth took a small step back, creating physical distance. "The rest of the committee should be here soon," she said, glancing at her watch. Mark nodded, accepting the change in tone. "They're actually not coming. The hotel liaison had an emergency, and the others thought we could handle the initial walkthrough ourselves." "Oh!" Elizabeth felt a flutter of both alarm and anticipation. "You should have told me. Would it have changed your decision to come?" His question was direct, his eyes holding hers. Elizabeth considered lying, then decided against it. "No." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "That's what I thought." He gestured toward the main ballroom. "Shall we continue?" They spent the next hour methodically examining the space, discussing technical requirements for lighting and sound, measuring dimensions, and checking electrical outlets. Their conversation remained strictly professional, yet Elizabeth was acutely aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment when their laughter synchronized. "I think we've covered everything," Mark said finally, checking his notes. "Unless there's something else you want to see?" Elizabeth shook her head, oddly reluctant for their time together to end. "I think I have what I need to develop the design proposal." "Coffee," he suggested, "to discuss next steps." This time, she didn't hesitate. "I'd like that." They found a small cafe 2 blocks from the hotel, a quiet place with round tables and comfortable chairs. Elizabeth texted David that she would be late, explaining about the design meeting running over. It wasn't exactly a lie, but the omission of with whom and where felt significant. Over cappuccinos, they discussed the gala initially, but the conversation gradually shifted to more personal topics, their respective paths into their professions, books they'd recently read, places they hoped to travel. "What about Italy?" Mark asked. "Have you been?" Elizabeth shook her head. "It's always been on my list, especially Florence for the architecture and art. David promised we'd go for our 10th anniversary, but then the firm was in the middle of a major project. And the trip never happened," Mark finished for her. "Life gets in the way sometimes." She stirred her coffee. "What about you?" "No wife insisting on romantic Italian getaways. Divorced. 3 years now." He said it matter-of-factly. "Karen and I married young. By 40, we had become different people with different priorities." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was amicable as these things go. No children, which made it simpler. We just grew apart." He looked at her intently. "Has that ever happened to you and David? Growing in different directions?" The question was too direct, too perceptive. Elizabeth looked down at her coffee. "All marriages evolve." "That's not what I asked." She met his gaze. "Yes. Sometimes I think we've grown in different directions." It was the first time she had voiced the thought aloud, and the admission felt both terrifying and liberating. Mark nodded, not looking triumphant or pleased, but simply understanding. "What do you do when you realize that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Try harder. Accept it. I'm not sure there's a right answer. There rarely is with relationships." He reached across the table, his fingers briefly touching the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort that lingered just long enough to become something more. "For what it's worth, I think anyone who stops being curious about you is missing something extraordinary." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. She should pull her hand away, change the subject, establish a boundary. Instead, she found herself turning her palm upward, her fingers interlacing with his for the briefest moment before she came to her senses and withdrew. "I should get home," she said, gathering her portfolio. "David will be wondering where I am." Mark nodded, not pressing but not retreating either. Of course. He paid for their coffees despite her protests, then walked her to her car. As they reached the vehicle, he said, "Elizabeth, I want to be clear about something." She paused, keys in hand, heart racing. "Yes, I respect your marriage. I respect David as a colleague. I'm not trying to," he stopped, reformulating his thoughts. "I enjoy your company. I value your perspective. Whatever else might exist between us, that's entirely up to you." His words placed the responsibility squarely on her shoulders, which was both honest and unfair. Elizabeth opened her car door, creating a barrier between them. "Thank you for today," she said carefully. "I'll have the design proposal ready by Friday's committee meeting." He nodded, accepting her retreat to professional topics. "I look forward to it." As she drove home, Elizabeth's thoughts were in turmoil. She had crossed no definitive line, yet the emotional connection forming between her and Mark felt like a betrayal of her marriage vows. The brief touch of their hands, innocent by any objective standard, replayed in her mind, each time with greater significance. David was already home when she arrived, unusual for a Tuesday. He was in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner, something he did perhaps 3 times a year. "You're cooking," she said, surprise temporarily displacing her guilt. He looked up with a self-deprecating smile. "Trying to. You mentioned wanting to do something different, so I thought, surprise." The gesture touched her deeply, all the more because it was so unexpected. David had made an effort, however small, to respond to her dissatisfaction. He had noticed after all. "Thank you," she said, setting down her portfolio and moving to help him. "What are we making?" "That pasta dish you like." With the sun-dried tomatoes, he was chopping garlic with more enthusiasm than skill. "How was the venue walkthrough?" Elizabeth hesitated, then opted for a partial truth. "Good. The space has excellent potential. Only Mark and I ended up going since the others had conflicts." David nodded absently, focused on not cutting himself. "Mark's a good guy. One of the best architects at the firm. Brilliant with spaces." "Yes, he is." Elizabeth busied herself with washing vegetables, her back to David. "We had coffee afterward to discuss design ideas." "Good." David seemed genuinely pleased. "I'm glad you're enjoying this project." "You've seemed, I don't know, restless lately." The observation, so close to the truth yet missing its essential nature, nearly undid her. Elizabeth blinked back unexpected tears. "Have I?" David moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders, a rare, spontaneous touch. "You know I appreciate you, right? All you do for us, for me." Elizabeth leaned back against him, allowing herself to be held. This was her husband of 18 years, the father of her child, the man who had built a life with her. "I know." They stood like that for a moment, close but not quite connecting, before David returned to his cooking and Elizabeth to her thoughts. Throughout dinner, as David talked about work and she responded appropriately, Elizabeth was aware of a fundamental dishonesty in her behavior. Not because she had done anything explicitly wrong, but because she was harboring feelings she couldn't share with him. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, David initiated sex, something that had become increasingly rare in recent months. Elizabeth responded to his familiar touches, closing her eyes in the darkness of their bedroom. But unbidden, Mark's face appeared in her mind, his intense gaze, his attentive expression when she spoke, the brief warm touch of his hand on hers. She pushed the image away, focusing on her husband, on the physicality of the moment. Yet afterward, as David slept beside her, Elizabeth lay awake, torn between guilt and longing, between the safety of what she had and the allure of what she didn't. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work commitments and preparations for Friday's committee meeting. Elizabeth threw herself into creating a comprehensive design proposal for the gala, working late into the night on detailed renderings and mood boards. The intensity of her focus was partly professional dedication and partly an attempt to distract herself from thoughts of Mark. They exchanged several professional emails about the project, each message cordial but carefully impersonal. Elizabeth analyzed every word for hidden meanings, then chastised herself for the adolescent behavior. She was a grown woman, not a teenager with a crush. Yet when Friday arrived, she dressed with particular care, selecting a structured navy dress that was both professional and flattering. She arrived at the meeting room 10 minutes early, her presentation materials meticulously organized. Mark was already there,